Hi, everyone. My name is Heather Morton, and I am here with Work Cookie today discussing EQ and mental fitness in leadership. Joining me today, we have the CBOC team, and I am super excited to discuss this topic. So, just to give a little insight on what mental fitness and EQ are. So, mental fitness goes into the emotional regulation, like the ability to identify, understand, and manage our emotions effectively within the workplace. And then EQ, depending on what theory you are really looking into, there are different dimensions. So these can be like self-awareness, self-regulation, motivation, empathy, and social skills. Again, there are different theories that look into EQ, but when you're combining it with that mental fitness, there are things like resilience, cognitive flexibility, social skills, and self awareness. So there are some intersections and overlaps between the mental fitness and EQ. So these are super important when you are looking at leadership. And when you are leading teams of individuals in the workplace, having this state of psychological well being is really important. And so I think as a leader in the workplace, it's really important to be able to control your emotions and also be self aware and able to recognize those of your employees in order to create that psychologically safe workplace and create an environment where your employees feel safe, you feel safe, and everyone around you feels safe. And I do have two articles I want to share in the comments, and these will also be in the notes in the podcast. So I'm going to share those real quick. Both of these are systematic reviews and literature reviews of empirical articles. They are more recent, so 2023, 2025, and they both have like over 100 studies within each of them that go over EQ within leadership roles. So very, very thorough when it comes to studying EQ in leadership and how they can be applicable in the workplace, which I think is super important these days. Um, I don't know about you guys, but I have worked in some places where EQ was definitely not a top skill with leaders. More recently this year, I decided to leave a role. I work primarily independent contractor, and which I love it. I will probably never go back to primarily W-2 employee. I just really love freelance. However, I did leave a toxic workplace. And even to this day, I still talk every day to one of my previous independent contractors. We work together really closely. And she was telling me just yesterday where our supervisor was bragging about how, and I don't remember the exact quote, but she was bragging about how each week one employee leaves due to her leadership style, which is just not, it's not something you should brag about. That's extremely inappropriate. It should not be something that one that's just not something you should say at all. But not only that, it was said at not just a meeting, but it was said to another client. So it was said to like a whole other business. And so if that's not lacking, if we're looking at like the dimensions of EQ and mental fitness, like that's a self-awareness thing that is lacking entirely. Social skills, self-awareness, all of those just lacking entirely. But also psychological safety, because when it comes to those employees, who's next on the chopping block? Because at that point, and I already knew this when I was working there, even though I was an independent contractor, I was like, okay, so even though I wasn't on the chopping block, I voluntarily left. What happens if I was going to be next? What if I did something and then she got mad at me and my contract was just up, broken, done? That would have been my job, my livelihood. That's not cool. And so I think as leaders, it is extremely important, one, to always be one step ahead, taking those steps to always improving ourselves, even if it's just 1% every single day. Oh, thank you for including that, Jason, in the comments. I actually have these as well. I'll put the links within the chat for both of those. There you go. Thank you. Um, I wrote a note for the article. It was emotional intelligence, leadership, and work teams. There was a takeaway that I wrote down, and it was that there was a strong correlation between leaders' emotional competence plus the team members' attitudes, engagement, and resilience. And this promoted trust, cooperation, and good communication. And so, like, when I was reading this, I thought about that experience that I had at that workplace. And so, while I was technically a leader, so I was a hiring manager, a contracted hiring manager at that workplace. And my team members, for the most part, had really great attitudes. And most of them had really great resilience. I will say that. But my other managers' emotional competence, I think, was such a massive hindrance. And so that was just the tipping point. It was just her incompetence was just hindering our inability to continue forward. So even if we had great attitudes and exceptional engagement and wonderful resilience, we couldn't offset anything else. And so, I don't know. In that moment, I just felt so defeated. It didn't matter how much training and anything else, like even my little IO brain and that like I even like I was doing weekly trainings, and at that moment I was only an independent contractor. I wasn't a fully hired on employee. I just felt so defeated in that moment. Like, what would you guys have done? Would you have stayed on and tried to continue? Or yes, LindaAnn.
I think depending on the situation, one of the keys there is there needs to be hope. Hope that there can be an improvement, right? And
Yeah.
a vision forward to say, oh, well, this can change, this can be better, there can be growth, there can be adaptation, any of those things. And a lot of times, though, when someone is that emotionally unaware and that kind of obtuse to what's going on around them, and how they perceive it, right? When you perceive uh, an exodus from your organization as a badge of honor, that's a little bit out of sorts, to say the least. And so when you have that kind of mindset with someone, the likelihood that you can change it in any meaningful way in a reasonable amount of time is so small that you're just, for lack of a better term, spitting into the wind with any of your efforts.
Yes. That makes sense. Yes, Jason.
I think it's a good parallel here with the home life and what work does to you at home. I mean, at what point does that toxic work environment, work relationships, or whatever, you hear people quitting all the time on LinkedIn. And
Mhm.
it's like, you know what? It's better for me not to have a job and deal with the stresses, related to being unemployed and the uncertainty of being unemployed than it is for me to be in a workplace where I'm bringing that stress and everything home because now it's impacting my family, it's impacting my kids. My kids are starting to become unhappy with me. Our relationships are breaking apart. My husband, I don't even know who he is anymore. He doesn't want anything to do with me or whatever it may be, or wife. I'm sorry, but whatever
Right.
your partner. So I think that is the most important takeaway from any of these experiences is psychology isn't just in the workplace. It
Right.
goes home, So that's my take on it.
Yeah. Yes, Laura.
I was going to say, I was going to chime in because I appreciated your like turn on the IO brain, right? Like how would I apply this? Like if I was in this situation as like a consultant and someone shared this with me, like what would I tell them to do? And I think one element of EQ is that reviewing what's in your control. What do I have control in the situation to have impact for? And all you can do is take care of what you have control over. So I've had some similar toxic leadership manager experiences. And I was working in as a contractor on a military base. So we had the inspector general office, right, to go handle certain complaint systems. So I could go to that. And if I felt like it was necessary, filing that, sometimes it went somewhere, sometimes it didn't. Sometimes it was dependent on other people speaking. So if they chose not to, it didn't go anywhere, right? For example. But then I could rest easy because I took care of what was within my span of control, and usually left those work environments if I could.
Right.
But I would say on the flip side too of being having been an employee, interacting with a lot of managers and doing manager training myself, like you were saying, like you're turning and having to train people, whether it was managers or not. It does make me think about if and when I have an opportunity to be a people manager, making sure I have the EQ to not let myself do all of these toxic things that I've had to deal with. Like how do you make sure that you don't be a problem manager yourself in ways?
Right.
So there's a lot of, I think, self-reflection when you're in those situations too. And control, as I mentioned at the beginning of it.
You mentioned like the spheres of, I think, was it spheres of influence? I ended up at one point, do you know the spheres of influence worksheet where you take like the circles and it's like the things you can control? I created one on a Google Doc, and because we had this shared Google Doc, and I was like, so this is my control, and this is like things that I can and what I can't. And then I was sharing it, and so then I was like this is what I can do myself. And I was sharing like this is what I'm doing today. This is what I can do. This is what I can't do, and this is what you can do. And this is like everything that I cannot do at all. And like these are things that could happen, but like I can't control that. But then my one of my like lateral, like she and I were like same level manager, told me that if I didn't let her do something, which like it was not in my control, that she was going to, I don't know if I can like say this on like a podcast, but she was going to like end her life. And I was like, oh, this is something I now have to report to my superior because, oh my goodness, like this is now a mental health crisis, that this is way over. Because like, as you're saying, like psychology does not just end at work. Like we are taking this way far outside of the workplace. This is now encompassing our mental health, our outside life, and everything is getting so enmeshed. And this is work. We should not be letting it get so engrossed into our mental health. And so lots of things were going on in this one project that I was like, we have got to take a step back. So, yes. And that project is still going on to this day. Like, and this started over a year ago. Yes, LindaAnn.
So one of the things that, and I learned this a very, very long time ago, is that when you have a high level of turnover, right, it's important. It's not the people, it's the manager, right? There's so much data out there that says people don't leave companies, they leave managers. And the other side of that, or the additional piece to that, is the organization that is not paying attention. right? Who
Mhm.
is not looking at the fact that we are losing all these people and it's always from this one person or these two people
Right.
ever. And they're not paying attention to that from caring about the people that report to them.
Mhm.
So there's that lack of concern on a human level, and there's the lack of concern for the organization on a financial level. And so there's so many pieces. It's not just the one individual who might not be emotionally intelligent and may be difficult. There's nobody home paying attention to do anything about it, too. And that speaks to a larger dysfunction within the organization. And so even if you go to a different person, right? Even if you say, for example, you were even able to do what that person who was in crisis
Mhm.
they needed to do, that doesn't mean that the organization around her would not have created that situation over again for her.
Correct.
Right? So it's really it's a lot of times it's beyond just the individual because the organization is tolerating the behavior.
Absolutely. Oh, if you looked on Google at the reviews, it was like, you can go to like Glassdoor and Indeed and all the other places. Like, it is like a consistent 1-star review of the same toxic behaviors over and over and over and over. And when I brought that up, because that's one of my things, when I look at organizations, I love to look at reviews and I'm like, hey, like I see these constant behaviors and these reviews. Let's look at these. Like, why are these what people are saying are happening? Let's pinpoint these. Why are these like key themes and habits? Can we pinpoint why people are experiencing these or perceiving them? Maybe they're not happening like you might think, but they are being perceived as happening. Can we pinpoint them and maybe change them? But when I brought that up, it was, oh, no, no, that's not how it happened. And so when we look at it that way, that's again, when we're looking at mental fitness and EQ, it's pointing to that lack of self-awareness. So, Nick, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, part of the problem is usually the person who's the problem doesn't see the problem. You're talking about the person who sees it as a badge of honor that people leave, and they have this vision in their head where my people are the people who stay are the ones who are tough, the ones who can put up with it, the ones who I have conditioned to be okay with this, and I don't think people are up late at night like the vaudeville villain twisting their mustache. It's just a matter of lack of awareness, lack of empathy, the sorts of things. And so you can't force somebody to do it. We talk about communication skills and soft skills, and all of that is so tightly wound up in emotional intelligence and mental fitness and things like that. And I think there is often the assumption that if somebody is qualified to do the job, they do it well enough that they get promoted, that we expect leadership to have these things. And we don't necessarily look for them. We just assume that they're there. And
Yes.
so you don't evaluate for it. And then when it doesn't show up, you're like, well, what happened? They're a leader. They're supposed to have it. And then they end up doing, the damage that they can do because work does tie up so many people and their identity and things like that. So it's hard to hear constant criticism or be in a bad environment or, I'm doing everything I can to do my job right, but I don't have the equipment. I don't have the support. And, perception is reality to some degree. So whatever, cyclone somebody is spinning in mentally because of bad management, part of the emotional intelligence is to stop and say what is actually going on and get to the root cause of what's going on. Like let's ignore the project that we can get to, but an emotionally mature, emotionally intelligent leader is going to stop and say, what's going on with you? I mean, I can track bad performance, to having a mortgage held up and things outside of work influencing work and not being able to see that clearly at the time. But if somebody had said, hey, you've got all the stress outside, do you think that's coming in here? I would have been like, oh, absolutely. That's why everything's strained here. So it's not an always on sort of skill, even for people who claim to have it. Everybody has a lapse. Everybody has their bad days, but hopefully The more you train it, because it can be like a muscle, it can be something where you bring your awareness to it and you can increase your ability to do so. But even the best trained, the most fit people have their bad days, and the impact of those hopefully isn't outweighed by the good days that they have.
I like it. Yes. Lee, over to you.
Well, as usual, LindaAnn hit on a very, very important thing, that there's an enabler to this behavior. The problem is only partially the bad management. What potentially a larger problem is the people who ignore it. And and there's two sides to that, because on one side, maybe they don't know. That's its own problem. And then the other is they know, but they're ignoring it. And that's a different problem, but just as problematic. And, in a situation like you were in where, a lot of it is contract stuff, a lot of times they don't, because it's unfortunate. A lot of people don't consider contractors people necessarily, because they're not employees. And so, I remember back, going on the Wayback Machine to my HR internship when I was graduating, and part of my job was the temporary employees, because where I was working is an industrial site. We had a hiring freeze, but I could bring in all the temps we could get, and so some manager would call up and go, "Hey, I need a welder." And I'd call up our contract agency and say, "Hey, send me a welder." And they literally could got them right off. If they didn't work out, didn't like that guy, I don't want him back tomorrow. Okay, send me another one. And the turnover costs are a little different, because you're not, literally I can have a new welder tomorrow from the agency because they have people. But when you're talking an actual, employee of the organization, now you're talking turnover. Now you're talking, that's when we've thrown those numbers around. The $250,000 it costs to potentially to replace someone. And you also have all the other issues. The psychological toll is an obvious thing. Physical toll. People start disconnecting. They start taking sick days. They start their productivity goes down. Maybe they ultimately get themselves fired because they're not performing, because it's just so toxic. And and kind of the way I've always looked at it is we promote people to their highest level of incompetence. So somebody took that person and they put them. Actually, I heard this person describe this once. Apparently, this is an out west thing, that this would be something I would describe as a post turtle. Because apparently, if you're out on the range and you come across sometimes a turtle that's sitting on top of a fence post, well, he didn't get there by himself, and he's got no business being there. That's people like that. That's the deal. They didn't get there because they were good at their job.
I'm
And
going to use that.
I love that. I think it was, to give credit, I think it was the Cowboy Libertarian, I think is who I saw that. Some is a blogger or someone. But so that's an issue. And, and it's not as visible in the contract environment, because, like literally, hey, send me another guy tomorrow. And a new face. Okay, cool.
So similar, not contractor, but I worked in the operating room for several years before ever getting into IO psychology. And we had travelers. And I would equate travelers to like contractors because they could come and go. Kind of like they weren't considered full-time employees of the hospital system, and they could get cut off without it impacting the hospital with turnover cost. But similar to those bad coworkers, we would have, and it was notorious, and it was every OR, every single OR. You would have people who would want to learn specialties, and that was me, and this is where it got me in trouble, because I wanted to learn every specialty, and I ended up specializing in trauma, pediatric neurosurgery, and that's what I learned. And then I ended up learning trauma orthopedic surgery, and so I specialized in those two. And so that got me in trouble because then I was the only one of two people in our level 1 hospital who could do both of those. And so I ended up working 12s, and that turned into 14 to 18-hour shifts on the weekends. And so it was made for very long weeks. And then I ended up privatizing and working with this one surgeon who worked a lot of hours. And then I became pregnant, and I was wearing 40 pounds of lead on call. And I mean, and it was just a rough time. But we would have these bad, I'm using these in quotations for those who are listening to the podcast, bad employees who didn't want to learn specialties, and they would be on 12-hour shifts, who couldn't, and I'm using these in quotation marks, couldn't scrub and assist these cases because they didn't know how to do trauma ortho and trauma neuro and trauma pediatric cases because they never took the time to learn them. And so it was just too, quote unquote, hard for them to do them. And so I would get stuck doing these 8 to 10-hour surgery cases, and which would put me working 10, 12, 14-hour days, 18-hour days. I mean, I would be in these cases for hours on end, which I loved it. Don't get me wrong. But when you're pregnant and taking a 30-minute break on a 14-hour shift, it's exhausting. And you would have these people who worked a 12-hour shift but sat for like 8 hours of their shift, and they'd be like, can I go home early? And I'm like, what? No, I'm confused at what's happening. So then I would volunteer. Hey, I'll teach them. They can come scrub in with me. They can sit and watch me. I will teach them. And the OR charge nurse would be like, no, they get scared of that. They don't want to learn. And I'd be like, what? I'm going out of my way to teach them for free. You don't even have to pay me the training hours. And so it was like enabling this bad behavior. And so not only was it like leadership was enabling this, but like the other coworkers would complain about the bad behavior, the leaderships would enable it, and then it was just like this perpetual cycle of bad behavior. But it was in every OR that I worked at. This was like the behavior. And it's still a common thing. I'm still friends with people who work in the OR, and it's still a common thing. Jason. Oh, go ahead, Lee.
No, I mean, that's what we call the self-licking ice cream cone. I mean, it perpetuates. And there are a lot of people out there who are going to provide the minimal amount of effort to not get fired.
Yes.
And their paycheck looks the same.
Yes. And that was the thing. Like my paycheck, and yes, I did work more, so I got overtime and all that kind of stuff. But like my paycheck would inevitably look the same if I worked the same amount of hours as the people who did the bare minimum, which was infuriating. Yes, Jason.
That's actually a great intro into my next part, because medicine is such a, complex subject. You know, for me coming through it, and for somebody that suffers from PTSD to a really crazy way at times, there's this thing we have called emotional dysregulation, right?
Mm-hmm.
And within the OR and all, I mean, everybody deals with it in some way or another when you're exposed to things over and over. And I still think it's a part of PTSD, but I'm off topic. But when you look at the literature review, the lit review here that you shared with us, emotional intelligence involves understanding others in the social context in such a way that it enables one to detect the nuances and emotional reactions and use the knowledge to influence others by controlling and regulating emotions. But if we're detached from emotions, or if we even bring this to a cultural standpoint where emotions don't belong in the workplace, then what? I mean, how do you change this? I love this from Clinton. Years ago, I learned it, the stinking thinking. The stinking thinking. How do you change the mindset where it's just, let me show you what you're actually doing to people? I understand that you believe that emotion does not belong in the workplace, but it's here regardless of what you think. And let me demonstrate where it is, and this is how we can approach it, right? So that's kind of a question that I have just to kind of put out there, because I haven't figured that one out myself. But
That's a good question. LindaAnn, I feel like you're really good with these kinds of answers. Do you have one?
I was thinking about LindaAnn the whole time. I was actually thinking about that question too, by the way.
Well, restate your question for me, Jason.
Yeah, so you have two different individuals. I mean, if we are in the medical world here, you have, emotional dissociation and that kind of stuff going on. But even in the workplace, you have this generational kind of mindset where emotions do not belong in the workplace, right? So you have this disconnect against, well, emotion, period, where your emotions don't come in. I'm not going to see your emotions, et cetera, et cetera. So you're kind of removing, yeah, before it even becomes a factor. How do we approach this as professionals, IO professionals, whatever we may be do in HR, and help leaders see this disconnect and how emotional intelligence is a great practice to, well, slowly get into. It's something that they're going to have to build over time. It's a skill set. I believe it's a skill set at least, but also do so sensitively where we're not going to push them away from that concept, right? Or the practice.
So it does, just because it's using the term emotional, right? Everybody thinks of somebody being, overreactive to things just because it's, it as an emotion. But that's not necessarily what is being considered in that emotional intelligence in the workplace situation. When you don't have an emotional connection, I mean, when you look at the data, there's 80% of employees are not engaged at work, right? And part of that is because there's no development of that emotional relationship with work. And nobody's working to make sure that they're connected to the purpose, that they're feeling an emotion, feeling fulfilled from work, right? So when we talk about emotional intelligence and what it means at work, it doesn't mean that we're sitting listening to somebody cry and wring their hands all day. It's about how do they feel when they turn on their computer? How do they feel when they are interacting in a Zoom meeting? How are they feeling about turning in that project and getting an accolade? How are they feeling connected on all those levels that contribute to some of the emotional connection and satisfaction that they feel from their work, which leads to an engaged employee. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. And it kind of reminds me of, well, positive deviance, right? Where you have a culture that you need to change. Somebody becomes deviant towards a certain practice that is, right, more harmful than helpful in that reaction towards that practice. But if that person is not being listened to, the leader should have, and this is just my mindset, so I'm more asking for clarification of it. As a leader, I should be able to identify that individual or that my employee is struggling, right? But if I'm completely disconnected, that emotions don't matter here, then I'm never going to see that person as struggling. You have a job to do, get her done, period. If you don't like it, leave. You're replaceable. And then we go into the rest of the conversation here. So that's my kind of question with the emotional intelligence thing is, how do I help others see the benefit of emotional intelligence within the workplace to be able to well, have that mindset, I guess.
Well, that's the thing, is we're not as replaceable as we used to be. Right. And so when you're looking, and that's just one of the frustrations of human resources these days, is when we're trying to recruit people, the unicorns that everybody wants as their employee, it's not so easy to replace those people that have left that you haven't paid attention to because you're only on a Zoom meeting with them and you aren't taking the time to interact on a meaningful level with them. It's all about work. Right. And so one of the things that when I'm coaching leaders is that make sure that when you have your one-on-ones, there's a difference between your project meeting and your one-on-ones. Your one-on-ones are not just about how much you've completed as far as work. Your one-on-ones are, so how are you doing? How, are you getting the professional development? Are you getting the projects that you want to grow? Are you feeling good about working with the team that you're on? Are you how are you managing your time when you've got 4 kids and 2 parents that all go to different sports? All of those kinds of things are part of that one-on-one to really do that check-in with your employee. And that's part of why there's this whole, I had this conversation yesterday with a client, the check-ins and people having struggling with, are we coming back to work? Are we doing hybrid and all those kinds of things? And I it's a rather crude, but I said, like in politics, when they said it's the economy stupid, well, it's the management stupid. And if you don't have the management skills to really get down and dirty with your employees and understand where they are and how they're doing, then you're going to have the turnover. It's really going to be a problem. And actually, the one client that I'm working with is the problem he's got is like nobody's leaving. If you got some, there's a couple people where you go, they're not performing, but if they left, I wouldn't be upset. They're not leaving.
Lee, over to you.
Oh man, that is so true. You get those who do just enough not to get fired, but that's as far as they're going to go. And why would they leave? If you're treating everybody well, why would they leave? You get to do minimal effort and still get a paycheck? I mean, come on. So that's a challenge there. But I don't know. I've had, my leadership style has been defined by the not just the education, but the examples, right? And I have had good examples, and I have had good examples of bad examples. And I learned from both. I want to be more like this. I do not want to be that. And so, you take those things and you add these tools to your toolbox, and that, you gather all these things together. You don't have to be one thing. You don't have to be, I took this one workshop and I have to be that. No, absolutely not. But, self-improvement is important. And you should, if you get put into a management position that maybe you weren't before and you're not comfortable, good. Maybe that should be your sign that maybe I should talk to someone, or I should read a book, or I should go to a workshop or something, that I should learn how to do this. And if your people are all miserable curmudgeons, it's possible they're, Walter Matthau, but then again, they're probably just unhappy. And why is that? So, was it Heather put in the chat, how are you? What is going on? One-on-ones for me are coaching sessions. It's not just a performance review. It's okay, here's what's going on. How are you doing? What's happening? What do you want to do tomorrow? What do you want to do next week? What resources do we have that can help you to get there? Even if that means that you will not be in the same chair later. And it's amazing the number of employees I've had who were just taken aback when I hit them with that, because I've never had anybody ask me that. Well, I'd say they're wrong, because if I bring you in and say, okay, where do you want to be and how do we get you there? One, I've created not just an employee, I've created an advocate. And two, I've got somebody who's going to work for me while they work for me. And three, I've got somebody who can, when it does come time to change, we can work together for succession planning. We can work for a smooth transition. They can help me to rewrite their job description. What do you do today that's different than what you did when you got here? What are the requirements? What kind of person? In fact, I've even had times where I had someone interview their replacement because we had made that, a thing. And just because you leave, some companies are like, if you leave, you'll never work here again. You're dead to me. The organization that I work for now actively recruits former employees. And we have a program for it. They actually have what they call an alumni website, where if you are a former employee, you can register on this website and be kept in the loop on things because you used to work here at some point, which is just, it's kind of amazing. Of course, part of that's the industry, it's, contracting type stuff, sometimes people leave not because they want to, but because the contract left. And maybe there wasn't another option right then. So it's a little different in part of the industry. But the fact is, I can put less work into bringing back someone who's been here before than I can someone with similar qualifications that are bringing off the street, because there's already institutional knowledge, there's already cultural knowledge, there's already tribal knowledge that they can come in and onboard faster because I don't have to teach that.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing. Nick, over to you.
I always, regret having to follow Lee because he makes himself sound like the best boss in the world. But at the same point, I think there's a component to emotional intelligence that becomes situational awareness, and I think it's incumbent on leaders to remember they have an obligation to the organization to get the job done. Like, that is a primary concern, but it doesn't always have to be the primary concern. To stop and check on people on a human level is also a very important thing, just out of decency, and because the workplace is changing. Jason was talking about that generation that was very stoic and don't bring your emotions to the workplace. We just got a job to do. It's not personal. It's just business. Well, yeah, that was the case, when, anybody could turn the wrench or make the thing go. But now, there's so much more dynamic work being done because the tools, the tools that are there make things easier. I saw somebody put up, AI isn't necessarily going to replace work in the way that the vacuum didn't replace house cleaning. It just made it better and more thorough, things like that. So, hold on, buddy. I got my train of thought derailed. So there is this human component, and you have to think about the whole person that works for you and hold that in tension with the job that needs to be done. In my previous role, was in charge of writing the schedule, and there's very real impacts of that. It's people's budgets, it's people's livelihood. They're working for tips. They want the good chips, and I always told them, I'm like, I get it. I'm trying to give everybody the chance to make money, and also my primary responsibility is to ownership, to put the best people out on the floor so the hospitality level is there, so the business reputation continues. And holding those things in tension is not always easy. And there were days where, my hands are tied, I don't have so many shifts to give. And, days where I'm looking at you going, hey, when I needed you for, Mother's Day or Father's Day, you were nowhere to be found. And so watching the person succeeding me having to write the schedule is fun and makes me realize that I did have a knack for it. But in counseling anybody who was like, I need more shifts, I'm not making money, my opening line was, I am never going to counsel you to do something that's outside of your best interest. If you've got to go, you've got to go. We'd love to keep you here. We'll do what we can, but we've got to keep everybody, with a chance to make money and do what they can.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing. Laura, over to you.
Yeah, I was kind of threw it in the chat, but I wanted to kind of bring it up again of in following this conversation of the coaching and whatnot that really the last three of us have all we've heard from have mentioned. It's that I think being a manager and being curious about your employees, so asking those questions during the one-on-one and whatnot, as well as asking follow-up in those one-on-ones about those interactions. So like in specifically thinking about like if you're noticing an employee in a virtual call has turned their camera off for parts of the conversation and come back on, or they don't turn their camera on during the call, or you're reading their face and their body movements during the call as the camera's on. I notice in certain environments people make an assumption about what is going on and why are you doing it? You must have not been happy about that, or your face looks like it's not happy. And literally in graduate school, my 1-year review in a 2-year program, one of my feedback items was that I do not have a poker face, and I need to be mindful in class of the faces I make, because people were interpreting my face negatively. And I try to share it, like, I'm very active, engaged. Like, if you notice, I turned off the camera because I was eating earlier. And I turned my camera back on. And if you notice, like, I'm very expressive while I'm listening. But that gets sometimes misinterpreted. And what I found in certain phone calls is people will give me feedback that I should, monitor my face, or you look like you weren't happy during that call. And what's wrong? It's not that I wasn't happy. So it's interesting to me that they're interpreting, and I'm getting feedback on an interpretation, but I was never asked, what were your thoughts during that call? What was going through your head? You seemed concerned. What was it? Right. And so it's an interesting, that's like the level of curiosity, I think, in an emotional intelligence kind of way, of catching your own assumptions and letting the person tell you their narrative rather than coming up with your narrative and applying it in that situation. And I kind of heard elements of that in all the different people that were speaking, but I thought I'd share that and give a good laugh, as I saw many of you were laughing when I made my poker face thing. And it's, as I mentioned, it's still clearly a problem in my work life.
I do not have a poker face either. It was very helpful when working in the OR because I was able to wear a mask, because when I am in awkward situations where people are arguing, I do this thing with my lips where I tuck my top lip like this. So if you're watching the YouTube video, you're in for a treat, because I'll do this. And my and I'll sit there and I'll just look around, because I don't like, I just get really awkward. And so I have to make myself very aware not to do that, because then it just, like, people will look at me and then it just makes them feel awkward, because what are you doing? And so I realized I was doing that the other day when 2 people were arguing in public and I was making this face. And then I was like, maybe they are looking at me because I am making this face. And so anyway, when I was in the OR, my eyes would just get really big when inevitably surgeons would be yelling, because that was just something they would do. And so my eyes would just be like really, really large in the OR. And so my mask saved me a lot, because you couldn't see what my lips were doing with my teeth. Anywho, okay, I don't want to. Is it Alanna or Alanna?
Hi, it's Alanna. I'm sorry.
Alanna, you're so good. No, I just didn't want to mess up your name.
No worries. And I wish I could turn my camera on right now. I can't at the moment. So I have a question. It's kind of twofold. So as leaders, how do we try to maintain that mental fitness when we're doing very well? But as I mentioned before, those who are not doing very well, they're doing the bare minimum, tend to cause like standardization, if that makes sense. So things have to change and kind of conform so that the not so good leaders can do what they're supposed to do, but it also requires the leaders who are doing what they're supposed to do to change their stuff as well. Like, how do we maintain that mental resilience and agility and drive to want to be successful? Like, what would be a recommendation for that, if that's a clear question?
LindaAnn, your eyes. Work on your poker face. What is your thoughts on that?
Yeah, my daughter sends me frequently. She sends me the meme that says, okay, you've learned to control your mouth, but not your face, right? And this is an interesting thing. So I was going to bring up a similar topic for discussion, and that was, often, and does this really fit under emotional intelligence? Because I've been in situations before where there was somebody who was the was it the turtle, the post turtle? Yeah, the post turtle, right? And And what happens is because they're not doing what they need to be doing as a leader, as a competent professional employee, they're kind of just there. Other people around them tend to pick up the slack, right? And so then they're not really suffering the consequences of their actions or inactions, right? Because whatever it is from upper management's purview is really getting done. And there was a time when I had to talk to some of the people around this person where and go, you've got to stop picking up the slack because the crap isn't falling where it belongs, right? We need to learn that he needs to be identified as somebody who's not doing the job. And instead he was being given all these additional opportunities and to get him further up the ladder of incompetence. And so I wonder how much of that is actually a little bit of emotional intelligence to know when not to step in and pick up someone's slack so that the organization can learn how to function properly to take care of a situation that's not a productive, healthy situation.
That's a good question. I mean, and it would also require consistency. Kat, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I absolutely think that there's a political savvy that comes with emotional intelligence. I mean, depending on what models you're looking at, but like reality testing is part of the model that I've been using for emotional intelligence, based off of Daniel Goleman's research and work on emotional intelligence. But flexibility, problem solving, all of these elements of emotional intelligence will absolutely aid the political savviness of not being the person that's going to carry the slacker's weight. Because when you think about it, and Jason, I see your LPC, you probably would agree. When we look at people pleasing types of behaviors and what people can do when they are working on boundaries or don't have boundaries, that all goes into the emotional intelligence part of it, right? So I would say that yes, political savvy and being able to say, not picking up his weight, but also be able to show up in the way that you do, that you need to, or any leader does, if they're trying to gain those footholds and get that visibility because they did take on projects. They're not going to do it for Bob over there that's not doing anything. And there's ways to do that, I would say. And I definitely think it's emotional intelligence that gets you there.
Absolutely. And Nick, over to you.
I mean, LindaAnn's point is well taken. I mean, I know that failure is one of the greatest teachers, particularly when it comes to, hospitality, serving tables, things like that. I learned more from the train wreck shifts than I ever did from the ones that went right. And where do you draw that, compassionate line of, I've got to push you into the deep end. You're not pulling your weight. You need to be exposed. And, people want to help, there's generally a compassion in, well, if they're not going to do it, then, somebody's got to pick up the slack. I don't want them to lose their job over it, but I want somebody to notice either that I am doing more or that they're not doing enough. And so it's really, again, comes with that situational awareness to say, okay, hey, I picked up, that extra task from you, please in the future be more aware of it. And you give them the 3 strikes and then say, you know what, man, you're on your own. You keep abusing my trust and I can't do it anymore. And that does take a certain level of maturity to be like, okay, here's my boundary. And I am aware of the professional consequences that may or may not happen. But I can only do so much and, have to stay in my lane as best I can.
Absolutely. Well, we are a little past 1:00. I want to be mindful of all your times. And I do want to make note, this has been a great conversation. I've really liked this. Much needed. And next week, we're going to talk about the future of work and artificial intelligence. And no, it's not taking over your jobs. Don't worry. Just like the vacuum didn't take over all your housework, it just helped it. So was it Nick? Was that who said that? Yes. So shout out to Nick for that. Yeah. Yes, Lee. I love that little dancey dance. So I hope to see you all next week when we meet, and have a fantastic rest of your Thursday and a safe and happy weekend. Yes, I love that too, Alanna. So I will count us out. Yes, thank you all for showing up. Enjoy the rest of your day. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1.